JavaScript is sort of the counterpart to server-side scripting languages. So if you remember when we looked at PHP, we said that it was a server-side scripting language. It means that it runs on the web server, and then it just sends back plain HTML to the web browser. Now, JavaScript is another scripting language. Okay, allows you to do somewhat interactive things, but the big difference is that JavaScript runs within the browser on the client side, as opposed to PHP, which runs on the server side. So what that means is that while they can do a lot of similar things, there's certain things that JavaScript can do which PHP can't, and likewise there's certain things that PHP can do which JavaScript can't. So when you're talking about server-side scripting languages, they really excel at things like accessing databases and that sort of thing, and anything that needs to be done securely. Okay, because you don't want to be sending sensitive information to the browser to be processed by the browser. So they both still have a place, but the big advantage of JavaScript running in the browser is that it can actually, once the HTML page is loaded into the browser, you can use JavaScript to actually manipulate that HTML and make it interactive and do all sorts of other things. So you might come across, if you're looking into this, you might come across the acronym DOM, D-O-M. Stands for Document Object Model. Essentially all that is how the browser keeps all of the HTML structure in its memory. Okay, so if you're ever inspecting the code and you're looking at all of these things, then the document object model is essentially the hierarchical tree of elements, starting with the HTML node at the top and then the body node under that, and then maybe your divs, your headings, your paragraphs. Okay, so it's the way that it keeps that in memory. And so it's that document object model that JavaScript can actually, because JavaScript runs in the browser, it has access to manipulate that, and we can do all sorts of nice interactive things with that. And generally that's been the main, JavaScript has been the main tool when it comes to making highly interactive web applications. So anything like Facebook or Gmail, any of those, all of the nice interactive stuff you see in that is all done using JavaScript. Okay, so I've got notes for this up in the usual place, my blog, dave.if90.net. This particular post was written by Cassie, but we're just going to use her content because it's quite good. So there's a bit of an introduction to what JavaScript is, kind of just said that. But here is also a side-by-side of, if we're talking about the common functionality of PHP and JavaScript, these two bits of code do the exact same thing, except the first example is doing it in PHP, and the second example is doing it in JavaScript. So you'll see that, and this applies to pretty much any programming languages, that there's a common set of functionality they have. It's generally just the syntax or the way that you write it that differs. So you'll see there's still things like, if you remember in PHP, we have to declare the start and end blocks using these PHP tags. Similarly, we do that with JavaScript by using these opening and closing script tags. Okay, and we still have the concept of variables, except that in PHP, where we define a variable by starting the name with a $, in JavaScript what we actually do is use a keyword var to say whatever comes after this is going to be a variable. And then in PHP, you remember when we use the echo statement, it outputs something to the screen. Okay, similarly, there's a way that we do this in JavaScript, and we can use the document.write method. Okay, so both these snippets of code will do the same thing. The difference is that this one will run on the web server and send the plain HTML back to the browser, whereas this one will actually wait until the web page is loaded and then run the script within the browser and then output it to the page. Okay, so Now, we're also going to look at something today called jQuery. So it's actually fairly uncommon that anyone writes just plain JavaScript anymore. There's a whole bunch of JavaScript frameworks that you generally use these days to make development a lot faster, make things easier, and make things consistent across all the browsers. So there's a bunch of these. One of the most common ones and one of the best ones for a lot of cases is one called jQuery, and this here is the jQuery website. One of the best things about jQuery is it's actually really well documented, probably more so than any other libraries. Okay, and you can see a list of all the different websites that use jQuery. Okay, so it's used heavily by a lot of big interactive web applications and websites across the internet. So essentially, well, we can read what jQuery is here. So jQuery is a fast, concise JavaScript library that simplifies HTML, document traversing, event handling, animation, and Ajax interactions for rapid web development. Okay, so those things that I've just listed are things to keep in mind, and we'll be looking at some of those. Essentially, all jQuery is a JavaScript file which you download, or you can download here, and you include in your HTML page. And really all it is a bunch of functions which you can call, which do things that add to the core functionality of JavaScript. Okay, so I might start with a very simple example first of all. And again, feel free to either follow along or as I do this, or just watch and take it in and maybe look at it later. I will post the screencast and the code for any of the examples I'm doing as well. So it's up to you how you want to do that. So what I might do is just create a new blank HTML document. And let's see. Okay, let's call this javascript.html. Okay, so here's my javascript.html file, and okay, it's just sitting here. So JavaScript, like if you remember PHP, it actually goes within an HTML file. So I'm just going to create a simple skeleton file here again. Okay, so there's my HTML file, and like with PHP, you can put JavaScript, you can intersperse it anywhere you like, really, throughout the HTML document. Although what you'll find is most common is that you put it all within one block somewhere, just to keep it kind of neat and tidy. So what's probably the most common thing to do is to put the JavaScript within the head section. Okay, and so we have an opening script tag, and we say the type is text/JavaScript. Okay, and then inside of here, this is where we write our JavaScript code. Okay, so one of the first things that any example will show you is a function called the alert function. Okay, and the alert function essentially allows us to output to a little alert dialog anything we put within these inverted commas. So you can say alert hi there. Okay, and if I run this and okay, so you can see, let me just refresh that page again. Okay, that simple function call will throw up a dialog like that. We can also, as we've looked at before, we can create variables using the var keyword, and we can say, let's say variable a equals 5, variable b equals 7, and then we can also do mathematical functions, just like in PHP or any other programming language. So we can create a variable that we'll call sum and set that to be equal to a plus b. Okay, and we can also output variables in the place of strings like that. Okay, and I can do combinations of strings. I can join strings together as well. So I can say the sum of plus a plus and b is, okay, so this, if you remember in PHP when we did string concatenation, was joining strings together. The only difference is the way we did that in PHP was we used a full stop as the concatenation operator. In JavaScript, which is probably a more common way of doing it, we use the plus sign. Okay, which possibly makes more sense. We join things by adding them together. Okay, so then I can refresh that page, and okay, you can see it's outputting the sum of 5 and 7 is 12. Okay, so generally your standard things you can do in any programming language. JavaScript has access to them. You can do things like if statements, for loops, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so all of those general concepts that we've already looked at in PHP, you should be able to take those across and apply them to JavaScript. The only thing that you'll change is a bit of the syntax. The way that you write it is different. Okay, now you'll also notice that unlike PHP, I'm actually running this file directly off my hard drive. Okay, so because the JavaScript is actually run in the web browser, it doesn't need to have access to the web server to actually execute that. Okay, so you can run JavaScript locally off a file on the hard drive. Now there is a but with that, okay, and I'll highlight that in our example. The one thing that we will need to have it on a web server for is actually to make our call to Yahoo pipes, and the only reason that happens to be like that is because of a security feature built into the web browsers. But generally, otherwise, you can run JavaScript just by opening the file off your hard drive. Okay, so I'm not going to dwell too much on the basics of JavaScript because the concepts are really quite similar to PHP. Although if you are interested in pursuing this, I would definitely recommend having a look at the JavaScript section of W3 schools. Okay, it's probably worth going through that, and it will show you all of the minutiae of what syntax to use and what different things do. Okay, but today I really just want to focus on some more practical examples. So I'm just going to do one more basic demonstration of this time using jQuery. So if you would like to look at this example, there's partway down the post, there's this basic jQuery fun link. If you want to download that, my desktop. Okay, and extract that. Okay, there's a file, initial example.html. Again, there's nothing that I need to run off the server in this, so I'm just going to open it directly off my hard drive. Okay, and this is what this looks like. I'll just open that up also in my code editor. Okay, so this is what this example looks like. Again, this is an HTML document. There's a bit of JavaScript here which I'll come back to. A little bit of CSS also there. That's all within the head section. And then I've got some pretty basic HTML within the body section. Okay, so this is what you're seeing output at the moment. We've got two divs. Oh, sorry, up the top we've got two buttons. Okay, and then we've got two divs. Inside of the first div is a heading, two paragraphs, and an unordered list with a bunch of list items. And inside and then we've got a second div which is effectively empty, aside from an empty unordered list. Okay, and that results in looking like this. Okay, so there's our first div, and here's our empty second div. So what I've done here is I've rigged up two buttons, and what I'm going to show you first of all is one of the other things that Jquery listed, okay, which is event handling. Okay, so when we're talking about event handling, we're essentially talking about interacting with the web page. Okay, so I'm just going to show you one simple example of event handling, and by that I'm talking about responding to clicks on an object, in this case two buttons. Okay, so I'm going to have these two buttons, and when I click on them I want to use some JavaScript and some jQuery to do various different things to the HTML that's in the page already. Okay, but before we get to that, what we need to know is how to include jQuery first of all. Okay, so on the jQuery website, you can go to this section, download. Okay, and okay, there's a whole bunch of past releases of it, but generally you'll want the current release. Now, there's two ways that you can actually include jQuery. We can download the file itself, put it in the same directory, and then just include it in our HTML file. But actually, probably the simpler way is to load it remotely off, for example, Google's web servers. Okay, so and the way that we do that is simply using one of these links here. So I'm going to take this first link, and I should probably explain that you'll generally see each version of jQuery has two versions. It has a larger version and then what's called a minified version. So the minified version is just compressed, and if you look at the code, it will look convoluted. So if you're trying to go through the jQuery code while you're developing, what you really want to have is the development version. Not that you'll probably ever need to look through the jQuery code that much because the documentation's so good. But certainly once you've developed and you've released, what you want to use is the jQuery min version, because it's significantly smaller. It's only a few kilobytes in size. So this is the one we're going to get, the one that's jQuery.min, and I'm going to copy that link address. Okay, and the way that I include this, you can see I've already done it up here, is by opening the script tag, again saying that the type is text JavaScript, and this is the way that we include a external JavaScript file, whether that's sitting in a directory on our hard drive or whether it's on a different web server. We use the src source attribute, okay, just like we would if you were including an image, and then we just put the URL or the file path to the JavaScript file that we want to include. Okay, and so once you've done that, then you have access to all of the jQuery goodness. So the important thing to remember, though, is that because all of this code will be interpreted line by line, top to bottom, you need to put this line including jQuery before you actually make any calls to jQuery. If you do that beforehand, it's going to go, I don't know what you're talking about, this jQuery, and it's not going to work. Okay, so that is probably the preferable way of including jQuery in any of your examples. And then you'll see there's a second script block here, which is actually the JavaScript that we're writing. Okay, so the first thing you'll notice is this thing called the document.ready function. Now, generally, whenever you're using jQuery or JavaScript in general, again, because the document loads top to bottom, if I've got any JavaScript written up the top of the document and I'm trying to manipulate HTML elements that are further down the document, well, these HTML elements haven't actually been rendered to the page until the processor gets down to there. So if I'm trying to, for example, say manipulate this div here in JavaScript code up here, then if it hasn't already been written to the page, then it's not going to work because it's not going to exist yet. So the way that we get around that using jQuery is to use this thing called the document.ready function. And what that does is it makes sure that the entire page has loaded, including all the scripts and all of the HTML, before it executes any of the code inside here. Okay, so any jQuery examples you'll see will generally always have this document.ready function and have the code inside of that. Okay, so now the second thing you'll notice is with all of jQuery's things, anytime you're calling a jQuery function, it starts with this $sign. Okay, so that's something that's built in. It's kind of a shortcut because you'll be calling jQuery functions quite a lot. The way that you always start it is with the $sign. So anyway, you see that, you know that it's calling a jQuery function. Okay, you'll see I've got a lot of comments within here. So again, the way that you write comments in JavaScript is the same way as we did them in PHP. You either have your single line comments here, which is // also you can have a multi-line comment, okay, which is / asterisk, and then the closing one is the reverse of that. Okay, so I have tried to comment this example so it's easier to follow. So as I've said here, code inside this function will only execute once the page is loaded, which is what we want. Okay, so now I've got most of this code commented out, and I'm going to uncomment it to show you what it does bit by bit, but the bits that I have uncommented so far is these two things here. And you can possibly guess from the way that it's written is that this is what sets up the behavior to occur when I click on either of those buttons. So this brings us to probably the most important thing to know about jQuery, and that is how we select DOM elements or HTML elements on our web page. And probably one of the coolest things about jQuery is the way that it does that is essentially says if you know how to use CSS, then you know how to use jQuery. So essentially what you do to select any element on the page is you have this $, and then in the brackets you have a string here which specifies essentially a CSS selector. Okay, so what I'm looking for here is something with so the hashtag means ID, obviously in CSS, and so I'm looking for something with the ID of B1. Okay, so if I go down here, you can see that I've set up this first button with the ID of B1 and the second button with the ID of B2. Okay, so therefore that one is selecting the first button and this one is selecting the second button. Okay, and so generally the process is we'll select some HTML elements in the web page and then we'll do something to them. We'll either manipulate them, or in this case we're setting up an event listener. Okay, so and the other thing with jQuery is that you essentially chain things together. So by that I mean I'm selecting it here and then I chain these together using the dot, and I can say, okay, whatever you've selected here, apply a click event handler to it. And any event handler then specifies a function where inside of that function, anytime that click is registered, the code inside of this function will execute. Now you'll notice that I've got all of the code inside both of these functions commented out now, so obviously nothing is happening when I click on any of these buttons. Okay, but I can, for example, so say alert button 1 clicked, and down here I can say alert button 2 clicked. Okay, and now I'll refresh this page, and when I click on button 1, okay, you can see that code is executing, and because it's inside a function, it doesn't matter how many times I click on it, it's going to keep calling that function and repeating the code, which is that alert one. Okay, and button 2, okay, similarly throws up an alert with button 2 clicked. Okay, so that's how we add event listeners. And if you've done any ActionScript, so Flash's programming language, then you'll probably notice a great deal of similarity between the syntax of JavaScript and the syntax of ActionScript, and that's because they're actually based on the same parent language or the same standard. Okay, so I'll get rid of those lines, and what I'm gonna show you now as I comment out some of these is just some of the ways that you can manipulate HTML elements within the page. And I've just got them set up within these click functions so that it happens as we click on the buttons. Okay, so the first example here is going to hide all of the paragraphs inside of div1. So I'll uncomment this second line. Okay, and again you can see the first part of this is a jQuery selector. Okay, so it's saying select the element with the ID of div1 and then any paragraphs underneath that. Okay, and then it's saying once you've selected those, hide them all. Okay, and I've generally got the reverse happening in button 2. So I'll uncomment this one here, and what this one is saying is again select any elements, any paragraph elements inside of an ID with div1 and show them, so make them visible. Okay, so if I go down you can see that my divs, I've given those IDs, so div ID equals div1 and div ID equals div2. Okay, so if I save that and refresh the page, okay, so I want you to notice what happens specifically to these paragraphs here when I click button 1. Okay, they disappeared, and when I click button 2, they showed. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is the fact that it wasn't just one of those paragraphs that disappeared. Okay, it was all of them. So this again is something that's a little bit quirky about jQuery, but it's actually something that's very powerful. Because these selectors act like CSS selectors, this is essentially saying, get me all of the paragraphs inside of the div1 div. Okay, so if I was doing this normally with JavaScript, okay, I'd probably have to go through and select, if I had 50 paragraphs, I'd have to go through and select possibly each of those individually and then hide them all. But with jQuery, all I have to do is one line where I can say select me all of the paragraphs inside of this div and then apply a particular effect to all of them, in this case hiding them and showing them. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember. Sometimes that can be slightly frustrating, but just remember, if you want to target a single element instead of all of them, then you can always give an element a unique ID name and then target a paragraph with the ID of whatever. Okay, so in that case it would say, okay, only hide the paragraph with an ID of paragraph 1 inside of the element with div1. Okay, so just like how a CSS selector, okay, if you apply CSS selector or a CSS style to to a P, so a single P, then it's going to apply that CSS style to every paragraph. Okay, in the same way, if you have a jQuery selector which just specifies a P, then it's going to select all paragraphs. Okay, so when you remember that, it actually becomes very powerful and a very efficient language to use. Okay, the next example is selecting, in this case, the entire div1, and then it's going to fade out, and then the opposite effect of this, when I click button 2, is going to fade that div in. Okay, so I'll refresh this page, and okay, you can see it does nice fade out effect and then a fade back in effect. Okay, so you can start to have sort of more animated-y looking things in your web page. Next example is, okay, the other thing that's quite common to do in JavaScript, so we can see that we can show and hide things. Okay, that's pretty simple. But we can actually interactively add and remove or modify the CSS that's applied to certain elements as well. Okay, so this next example does just that. So you'll see down here I've predefined a couple of styles. So there's the one that's giving my div that grey background, for example, just so that we can see it. And then I've created a CSS class called Big Red Text, which makes the text color red and the font size 24 pixels. Okay, and so what I'm going to do here is say, with my jQuery selector, I'm saying, okay, find me the element with ID of div1, and then inside that, find me any list items that are oddly numbered in the list. Okay, so down here, there's my div1. Okay, inside of that I have a bunch of list items, and what this is going to do is select every odd numbered list item. Now, the important thing to remember is that this, again, we talked about indexing things and we were talking about arrays. The first list item is going to be item 0. Okay, so the first list item is actually going to be, the first odd list item is actually going to be item 2. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember. So essentially this selector is going to select list items, or down here it's going to select that one and that one, items 2 and 4. Okay, and once it's selected those, I'm calling this jQuery function called add class, where I essentially specify any CSS class that I've already defined. So this big red text one, and I'm saying add that class to any odd numbered list items inside of div1. Okay, and then down here when I click button 2, I'm essentially doing the opposite of that. I'm selecting again the odd numbered list items, and I'm telling it to remove that class from it. Okay, so I'll refresh the page. Okay, and it might be worthwhile to look at the code inspector while we do this. Okay, so there's my unordered list, my list items. Okay, and if we look at, say, this one here, alright, we notice that it's got, it doesn't have any of my CSS styles applied to it. Okay, it's only got the default styles applied. When I click button 1, okay, you can see that it's now added to these list items class big red text. Okay, and it's applied whatever the style that I've defined as that class in my CSS as. And then when I click button 2, okay, you can see that it has removed that big red text class from those. So this is what we're talking about when we say the DOM, the document object model manipulation. All we're essentially doing is we're inserting bits of extra code into the HTML, and then the browser just reprocesses that. So from the browser's point of view, all it's seeing is that it's added that class attribute big red text, and it's just re-rendering it based on what the HTML is. Okay, and it's the JavaScript that's manipulating the HTML. Okay, next example is, okay, so this example is actually going to apply to our pipes example. Okay, and this one is about injecting extra content into the HTML document. So what we can do is we can remove, modify, change, or add content within the HTML document after it's been rendered. And one of the most common ways that we do that is, again, first of all, I'm using a jQuery selector here. This time I'm selecting div2, okay, which, as we can see, is a div which contains just an empty unordered list. And once I've selected that, I'm calling the append function, which essentially adds to the end of that a paragraph. Okay, so, it adds to the end of that whatever we happen to put in here, and what I have in here is a paragraph with some text. Okay, and for the button to click, what I'm doing is I'm again selecting div2, and this time I'm saying, because each time I click button 1, it's going to add another one of those paragraphs. So what this one is essentially going to do is reset the contents back to what it already is, okay, which is an empty div just containing an empty unordered list. So the way that I can do that, and this is another jQuery method used to modify the contents, is saying I can say div2.html, and then whatever I specify in here is going to replace the contents of div2. So what I'm doing there is essentially inserting that empty unordered list back into there to reset it back to the state that it was in before I messed around with it. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. So here's my button 1. Let's look at div2 here. Okay, there's my empty unordered list. Okay, and when I click button 1, okay, you can see that it's added a paragraph to the end. I click it again, okay, because this is event handle, it just keeps calling that function. I can just keep clicking this, and it's just going to keep appending that paragraph to the end. So it's essentially putting it after the last thing within this div2. Okay, and I can do that as many times as I want. Okay, until I click button 2, which is going to take the entire contents of this div2 and replace it with the empty unordered list again. Okay, so there it is. Reset back to how it was. Okay, so let's see, where are we here? Okay, now this next example, I'm going to keep this one here on button 2, set it back to its original state, but what I'm going to do here is a slightly different version of the append, what I just did then. What I want to do now is actually, and this is the reason I have that empty unordered list inside of div2, is append list items to that. Okay, so my selector in this case is going to be find me the unordered list inside of the div2 div, and to the unordered list append a list item. Okay, now I don't just want to append a list item. What I actually want to do is excuse me. What I want to do is append list item which says item, and then increase the number with each item that I add. So this shows us how to do another thing, which is that jQuery will let us do, which is actually get the number of items that are inside of something. So I've created here a variable called items, and what I'm doing here is I'm using this selector div2 unordered list items, okay, and that's going to return me any list items inside of that unordered list. And then I say .length, okay, and that's going to tell me how many they are. So the first time I hit this button, obviously the result of that is going to be 0. Okay, there's no list items in there. So what I want to do is add 1 to that, and then output that as the number that is printed out after items. So the first time I click this button, this function's called, then there's going to be 0, so items is going to equal 0 plus 1. The next time I come through and click the button again, okay, there will be this list item that I've just added. Okay, so this selected.length is going to equal 1. I add 1 to that, the next one is going to print out as item 2, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's see how that goes. Again, we'll look, here's my empty unordered list. I click button 1. Okay, and now my unordered list has a single list item in it with item 1. The next time I click it, okay, item 2, item 3, okay, and again, I'll do this as many times as I want. Okay, so each time it's coming through, it's counting the number of list items that are already in there and then outputting the next one with 1 plus that number. Okay, and again, button 2 is going to replace the HTML contents of div 2 with just that empty unordered list again. Okay, and again, I can just keep going over and doing this again. Okay, so you can see how this is becoming more like an interactive application as opposed to a website where you load it, read the content, and then go to another page. So, okay, let's see, what else do we have? Okay, so we've got one more example. Okay, and this one, okay, this one is to again highlight the fact that the Jquery selectors will select multiple things if it applies. Okay, so in this case, rather than selecting a specific ID, I'm selecting all divs. Okay, so if I just wrote div as a CSS class, it would apply it to all the divs. Similarly, as a Jquery selector, okay, this is going to select both my div 1 and div 2. And then this is another way that we can manipulate the CSS. So we did add class and remove class, but we can actually specify the CSS directly as well. So what this is going to do is, so this CSS function essentially takes 2 parameters. The first one is the name of the CSS property, and then the second one is the value that you want to apply to that. And what we can actually do is, rather than applying a specific value, so in this case I actually want to increment and decrement the padding. So I want to increase it by 5 pixels every time I press button 1 and decrease it by 5 pixels every time I press button 2. So by using this plus equals 5, that allows me to do that. So each time I press that button, it will increase by 5. And similarly, here, by using minus equals, it's going to decrease the padding by 5. Okay, so I could have just specified a number here and say, well, make it 100 pixels, but it's not going to change every subsequent time that I click the button then. So I'm going to leave that by saying plus equals 5. Okay, refreshing this page. Alright, so if I look at either of these divs, okay, you can see that my the CSS that I have applied to this div by default gives it a padding of 5 pixels. Okay, so you can see that applied here. And when I click button 1, we should see the padding for both div 1 and div 2 increase by another 5 pixels. Okay, so you can see that both visually over here, and you can see it also added as an inline style here where the padding is set to be equal 10 pixels. Now you'll notice over here that my default div style, the padding over here is crossed out. Alright, and that's because the inline style that's been applied with Jquery is actually going to override that style there. Okay, so again you can see that if I keep clicking button 1, okay, the padding keeps going up by 5 pixels, and Alternatively, button 2, the padding keeps going down by 5 pixels until it reaches 0. Okay, so there's some pretty simple examples, but essentially you build upon that same process of selecting some elements in the page and then manipulating them in some way, and you can create all sorts of different interactive or animated effects in your web page. So where to find those things? The best place is to look on the jQuery webpage, the documentation section. So if we just quickly look at that, okay, there's a bit of an intro, which would be good to look at down here. But then there's also an API reference over here. Okay, and this is divided up into the various different things that you will do. So, for example, selectors here. Okay, we'll show you all the ways that you can select various elements on the page. Okay, so for example, you can select checkboxes that are checked. You can do more specific parent-child selectors, just like you can in CSS. Okay, we looked at the selecting odd things. You can select even things as well. Okay, lots and lots of them, which should cover pretty much any selection thing that you want to do. But actually, most of the time, you will probably just be selecting something based on its ID. Okay, and then okay, then there's a section called Events. Okay, which looks at all of the other kind of events that you can add. Okay, so we already looked at click. All right, and it gives you example code. Okay, so that looks very much like the function that we wrote. Example code that you can just copy and paste and then modify. Okay, as well as what it looks like. Not sure what this one's actually meant to do, but anyway. Okay, so this one combines some sliding animation, those sorts of things. Then there's effects, so you can, all the animation, fade in, fade out kind of things that you want to do. The different ways you can manipulate CSS, so you can see there's the add class and the CSS methods, but then there's all sorts of other ones, so you can detect to see if something has a class. You can set the width and height of things. Okay, pretty much any way you could dream of manipulating your HTML and your CSS, you can do using jQuery. Let's see what else. So there's also, I should just mention, we won't really go into this today, but the other cool thing about jQuery is that jQuery itself has plugins that you can use. So, for example, there's this one called Jquery Ui, okay, which has a bunch of pre-built kind of widgety things. So, for example, something like a calculator or a color picker, something like that, various different interface kind of things like tabs and so forth. And again, the way that you just add that is simply to add the Jquery UI file in the same way that we added the Jquery file, and then you look at the documentation to see how you actually use it. Okay, so for example, you can have this thing which is like an accordion widget. Okay, and it's all pre-built. Essentially, you just have to have a bunch of list items with content, and then you make a particular jQuery call, and it will turn it into an accordion like this for you. Okay, and that would probably take you a week to build by yourself if you didn't have the advantage of that. Then there's this plugin section which is currently being updated, but you can look at the old plugin directory. Okay, so you can find all sorts of things like, let's see. Okay, so if you want an interface where you want drag and drop stuff, again, it'll probably take you ages to code by hand, but you could use a Jquery plugin that allows you to do that yourself. And it usually goes something like you'd have a div, and you call a Jquery function that said select this div, and then a function called like make draggable, and that's all you have to do. Then you load the page and you can click and drag it around the screen then. Okay, so lots of very, very powerful things you can do. If you decide you want to include those in your mashup, that's entirely up to you, but I can probably direct you in the right direction to go. You can find things like image galleries and sliders, all kinds of different things. So just keep that in mind as to how there may be things that might enhance your interface there as well. Certainly don't have to do it, but the option is there if you want to. Okay, so let's move on to the main practical example where we actually use JavaScript and jQuery to interface with Yahoo pipes. Okay, so this is essentially going to be very similar to the PHP example that we did, but using using JavaScript instead of PHP. Okay, so I have a link to the pipe here towards the end of the post, and okay, let's try that again. Link to the pipe. Okay, so the idea behind this one, not particularly original, it's probably been done 1,000 times before, but the idea of this one is to pull the list of the top selling songs from iTunes, and then using that information, mash those up with music videos that are found on YouTube for each of those songs. Okay, so the way that I've done that is, first of all, just close some of these down. Okay, so there's a thing called the Itunes Rss Generator. Okay, and it allows you to select various different countries' app stores. So, for example, I can select Australia, music, and top songs, and I'm just going to get 10. And I hit generate, okay, and then that gives me a URL to access that RSS feed. Okay, so if I look at that, there it is, there's the RSS feed, so that's something obviously we can pipe into Yahoo Pipes. Okay, so this is essentially it here, building that URL. I'll explain this a little bit later, but essentially I fetch the feed using that URL, okay, and there you can see there's a bunch of songs, or the top 10 currently selling songs on the Australian iTunes store. Okay, and then what I've got here, and this is actually something I haven't really showed you in Yahoo Pipes yet, and I'll probably just go over it pretty quickly, but I can go over it in more detail maybe in later examples. But what I've actually got here is two separate pipes. So I've created this second pipe here, which accepts the song title, and then appends to the song title the text official music video, and then pumps that through a YouTube search, and then just finds the first result. Okay, so if I haven't entered anything in here, it's just getting me the first result when I search for official music video. Okay, but looks like a music video, that's fine. But what I can do here, by using this this loop module, and you find that within the operator module. Okay, it probably seems kind of complex when you first look at it, but once you get it, you go, yeah, this is really powerful thing. So essentially, what we do is we drag this module on, and then we can put other modules within it, or indeed entire other pipes within it. So what I've done is I've gotten my YouTube music video pipe, okay, and I've dragged it within there. Okay, and there seems to be a bug with Chrome that doesn't allow you to do this, so I used another browser when I created that. Okay, but essentially you put that in there, and what that does then is it passes this feed, and for every item in that feed, it then passes it into my YouTube search module. Okay, so in the feed I have, the item title, okay, which is the name of the song and the artist from the iTunes RSS feed. So what I'm saying down here is that because my YouTube music video search, okay, has a text input, okay, if I then put that inside of this loop, it allows me to pump anything from this RSS feed into that input. So what I'm doing is I'm sending the item title from the RSS feed to my YouTube music search module, and then I'm saying here, assign the first results to this new item that I'm going to create in the feed called music video. Okay, so you'll see that when I've just gotten the feed, okay, there's no item called music video, but once I've passed it through the YouTube music video search, okay, there's now this new item here called music video, okay, and that has a link to the YouTube search result for that song title plus official music video. Okay, so that might be a little bit to take in at the moment. I'm happy to go through that in more detailed examples later on, but what I really want to focus on today is the processing of that feed with JavaScript and jQuery. So essentially what I get from the output of this is a list of the top 10 best-selling songs on the Australian iTunes store, with also a link inside of them to what hopefully is the accurate search result from searching for its music video. Okay, so now let's close this. Okay, so let's see, I need to create. Now, in this example, I said before that you can run the JavaScript stuff locally off your hard drive with a but. So this is the but. When we're making calls to the server, because of security reasons in the browser, for this example to work, you will actually have to run it off a web server, whether that's your local web server or the Qt web server, doesn't matter. Okay, but I am going to have this file sitting on. Okay, so I'm going to connect to my Qt web server space. It's my public HTML folder, KIB 204. Got a folder here called Jquery and Yahoo pipes. Let me delete that, don't need that. Okay, and I will open this file in my code editor, and let's just delete all of that stuff and rebuild it again from scratch. Okay, we should have time. Alright, so again, I'm going to start off with a skeleton HTML document. Okay, and alright, the totally unoriginal title I'm giving this mashup is Itunes. I'll start off by putting a heading 1 in body. Okay, and yes. Okay, and I'm just going to load it up in a web browser. Okay, so now I'm browsing my space on the Qt server. It's the folder. Okay, so far nothing in here but a heading 1. Okay, and let's see, I might just flick back and forth and reference my original example. Okay, so I'll create a container div around this. And I'll create a content div to hold my my pipe results. Oops. Content. Okay. Alright, so now I'm going to add my jQuery. I'm going to embed jQuery in this, so I'm going to use the I'm going to embed it using the version hosted on Google. Okay, I've actually got the code for this on the on my blog post as well, but you can also find it as I showed you before on the jQuery website. If you go to download and copy this link here. Okay, and so we go script, type, text, JavaScript, source, and then we paste that address. Okay, and close that script tag, and then I'm going to open another script tag. Again, type text JavaScript. Okay, in this case, which is going to be my embedded code. And I should just mention quickly as well that I know these examples that I've all been doing. Okay, I've been embedding the CSS and the JavaScript in the same page. Now you can have your JavaScript in an external file, an external .js file, just like you can have your CSS in an external file. Okay, and if you want to do that, and if your JavaScript gets really huge, that might be a good idea, just to make it easier to read. But the way that you would include that is the same as this, except instead of putting this URL here, you just put the relative path to the JavaScript file like you would the CSS file. Okay, but that's aside. Functionally, it doesn't really matter whether you put it embedded or as an external file. Okay. Alright, now first thing we need to do is the document .ready. Okay, and if you need to reference this, okay, because that can be a slightly difficult thing to remember, then okay, so in the documentation section of the jQuery page, if you look at how jQuery works, okay, and you scroll down a bit, it shows you the code for that there. Okay, so if you're worried about making a mistake with that, then the easiest thing might be to copy and paste that. Okay, but it's document.ready, and then function, and then open closing brackets, and then okay, so it looks like this. Okay, now I usually like to just do an alert here just to test that I've got it working. Okay, so if this works, we know that jQuery has been loaded properly. Ignore that. Alright, there's my alert saying that it works. So I know that jQuery is working and that my whatever I'm putting inside of my document ready function is also working. Okay, so what we need now is, let me just refer back to this. Okay, let's start by putting this in here. So, if you remember back to the PHP example, the first thing we need to do is get a URL which points to the data feed from Yahoo pipes. So I need to go and look at this pipe here, and let's go and view the results of this. Okay, and we have to run the pipe once to get something. Okay, so remembering this section here is where we essentially access all the URLs to get the pipe data in different formats. So when we did the PHP one, we copied this link here, get as PHP. What we're going to use for this example is the get as JSON. JSON, okay, that stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Essentially, it's just another format, another format for defining data structures. You probably don't need to read up on that, but if you want to, there is a section on Learn JSON on W3 Schools, and it will essentially just show you the data format. So if you ever were creating JSON data and needing to send that, then you might need to know that, but I'm sure for these examples you really don't need to bother, other than to know that it's just another way of defining data. Okay, like RSS, like XML, like the PHP serialized object. This one just happens to be, because it's JavaScript object notation, JavaScript has built-in ways of manipulating that, which make it quite easy for us. Okay, so I'm going to copy the link to this get as JSON URL, and I'm going to create a variable using the var keyword called URL. Set that equal to that link that I just copied there. Okay, so you'll see again, it looks very similar. There's the pipes.yahoo.com/pipe/run. There's the pipe ID again. Okay, but this time it has underscore render equals JSON. Okay, whereas when we did PHP, that was PHP. Okay, now once I've got this, I need to make a call to actually get that data from Yahoo pipes. Now, the way that I'm going to do this is by using a jQuery method, which I will look up now. Okay, so jQuery, so what we're doing now is, you've probably heard the term Ajax, okay, which is another of the multitude of acronyms. Stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Not that you really need to remember that, but what Ajax is any time that you see something change on a web page that has where the data's being gotten from somewhere and it's loaded and it puts it on the web page without the web page refreshing, then it's done that using Ajax. So what Ajax allows us to do is actually go and get data from a server and embed it within the page with actually having to refresh that entire page like we would if we were just calling another PHP file. So let's see an example. So anytime, if you think to when you're posting something on Facebook, okay, when you post on Facebook, you type it into the text field, you press post. Okay, the page doesn't reload, but you probably just get a little loading indicator, and then the content updates and it shows you a post there. Okay, it's done that using Ajax. When you click that send button, it's sent that bit of text off to the server. It's got a response, and then it's updated the page without refreshing the whole thing. Okay, so again, that's just another way that makes our applications feel more like native applications, more real time. If we can modify things about the page without actually having to reload the whole thing. Okay, so jQuery's getJSON is a sort of wrapper function which simplifies the process of doing an an Ajax call, which if you do it in plain JavaScript is actually quite verbose because you have to deal with the different ways that different browsers do it. But with this jQuery getJSON, we just do it once and it caters for all the different browsers. Okay, so there's an example here of how you use this. Okay, so it essentially looks like a $, which is just saying the jQuery object, and then getJSON, and then we pass it a URL, and then just like when we created our click event handler, we define a function which should be called when the result of that returns. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so $.getJSON. Okay, and first parameter I'm going to pass it is the URL that we've just created. Okay, and the second parameter is going to be function. Okay, and the function will automatically once that Ajax request has been returned, okay, it's going to pass our function a object which we can give any name we want. We'll give it a generic name like data. Okay, and that data object then is going to contain all of the information from our Yahoo Pipes feed. Okay, so the first thing I usually like to do, again, just to test that this has worked, is I'm going to type something called console.info. Okay, so console.info is kind of similar to alert, except that instead of outputting anything to the web browser that you can see, what it does is if you have Firebug or any of the equivalent code inspection things, you'll notice that there is usually a section called console. Okay, and what this does is give you error messages and feedback and whatever, but you can also output things to this, so it's really useful for debugging. So anything I output here will show up in the console. So what I actually want to output in this instance is the data, okay, that's being returned from our getJSON call to this Yahoo Pipes URL. Alright, and if this has worked correctly, then we should see what looks like all of the pipe data output in the browser's console window. Okay, so let's put this side by side again. Okay, and you can see it's taken a little while to do it, okay, because it has to send it off and then it has to wait for it to send the data back. Alright, but you can see this is there's some other debug information that's being printed out, but this here is the output based on the console.info call that I did. Okay, so you can see it's an object. Okay, and this looks very much like our big giant array that was returned in PHP. Okay, and it should also look very much like the debug view of the pipe that we're used to seeing. Okay, this even has the drop down arrows that look like it. Okay, so again, what you can see is some information about the pipe, but then there's this object called value, and inside of that it has an array of the items. Okay, so these are actually our pipe items, which I can see in here. Okay, so there's the title and the link, okay, and all the other things associated with them, and there's our music video object containing the YouTube search result. Okay, so this object represents, okay, this data thing here. So you can see, in order to, if we're just interested in this items array here, then what I really want is data dot value dot items. Okay, so if I change this to data.value.items, whoops, items, okay, refresh that again. Okay, now you can see it's just showing me that list of 10 objects that's being returned. Okay, so this is our items list. Like, if you remember at this point in our PHP example, we go, okay, we've got our items list now. What we want to do is loop over these items, extract the information that we're interested in, and then output those to the page. So essentially, that's the exact same thing we're going to do in this JavaScript example. So what I might do is actually create a variable called items and set that equal to data.value.items. Okay, so now items is just my list of pipe items, and I'll keep this console.info outputting items, no harm in that. What I want to do now is set up a looping structure. Okay, so if you remember, we did that in PHP. I could use a JavaScript built-in looping structures, but just to demonstrate another feature of jQuery, what I'm going to use is a jQuery function called the each function. Okay, so jQuery's each function. Okay, if you read this, it basically says that you give the jQuery each function a bunch of data, and it will loop over that for you. Okay, so in the same way that we would create a loop. So the way that we do this is we say, again, $.each, and then we give it the object or the array that we want to loop over, and then again create a function which will automatically be passed an index and a value for each of the items in that list. Okay, so again, if you need to copy and paste from the examples, that's absolutely fine. Okay, but it looks like $.each. Okay, and I'm going to give it as the first parameter this items object, or the items array. Okay, and then I define a function which will be passed both the index and let's call it the item, singular item. Okay, so what I can do now is okay, so each time through this loop now, it's going to refer to each one of these different pipe objects that are in our list. So what I can do now is go, okay, well, for each of these items, get whatever it is that I'm interested in. So let's say first of all we'll just output the title of each of these items. So what I want to do is I can create a variable. Let's call this title. Okay, and that's going to be equal to item.title. Okay, again, this structure is going to match what you see in the debug window of the pipe, and it also should match what you see in the structure of the objects that are output in the console. Okay, so there's object, so item.title there, so that should be the first one, and then so on and so forth for the rest of them. Okay, so now we're going to use one of the things we looked at earlier, which is, okay, we've got this information, now we want to output it to the web page. So you might remember we had this jQuery function called Append. So I've got this div with an ID of content here, which I can select using the jQuery selector and saying, get me the thing with the ID of content. Okay, and once I've got that, I want to say append. Alright, and I will append let's say, a paragraph with the title and closing paragraph. Okay, so it's appending this whole thing, but this whole thing is an opening paragraph tag plus whatever title happens to be and a closing paragraph tag. Okay, so this will loop through 10 times for each one. Each time it will pull out the item's title and will append it to the content div. So what we should see is the titles of all 10 of these items output as paragraphs. Okay, and so we'll look at this page again. There you go. Okay, so it actually happened quite quickly. Okay, so there's my container, which, as you can see from the HTML file, was empty, and it's now got the titles of each of those items in the feed output inside of paragraph tags. Okay, so, and as I said when we got to this point in the PHP example, that's pretty much all there is to it. All you do now is you pull out different information and you decide how you want to output it on the page. So, so let's grab some more information. Let's go, okay, so let's go description equals item dot description. Now the item description actually contains a lot of stuff in this example, so so it's actually kind of handy for us. We don't have to do much, but what I'm actually going to do, this will start to get a bit convoluted if we keep doing append things. So what I'm going to do is create a variable here called HTML. Okay, and I'm going to make that equal to an empty string. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep building upon that HTML string and then build up the contents of what I want to output, and then simply output that HTML variable here. So I'll append that there. So actually what I want to do is, and this is a part where actually PHP is probably a little bit easier to do, because we can intersperse the PHP and the HTML tags. In this way we actually have to build up the HTML as a string and then output it like that. So what I'm going to do is build upon this by using HTML plus equals. So plus equals is like saying take whatever HTML is and then add this to the end of it. And so the first thing I'm going to do is add a div tag with a class of item. Okay, notice again that I'm interspersing my double inverted commas with single inverted commas so that I can use these ones for the attributes and not break the formatting of my string. And then I'm obviously going to need to close that div. Okay, and okay, so now inside of my item div, I want to have another div which holds the description of the pipe. Okay, and along with that, I'm going to output the description variable up here, which I pulled out of the item object. And then I'm going to close off that div there. Okay, so we'll start with this. Okay, and so what I should end up having, and so this call here is now just appending whatever HTML I've built inside of this string. So it's going to be a item div, and inside of that is going to have a description div, which is going to output inside of that what I've pulled out of the description. I'm no longer outputting the title because, as you'll see, the description actually contains the title as well, so that's going to kind of be redundant. Okay, so we'll refresh this page and hopefully that's worked. Okay, there you go. So if we look at the content here, alright, there's my divs containing the description. Okay, and so all of this table HTML inside of here is actually what you would see in the description content. So if I look at the console here, okay, there it is there. Okay, so you can see the description actually is a bunch of HTML code. Okay, so the description contains all of this stuff here, which is kind of nice. Means I don't have to pull out all of the links in the title and the image itself. I can just embed it like that. Of course, there's nothing to stop me from doing that if I want to format it in a different way, but we don't really have time to go over all of that in this example. So I'm just going to leave it as that. Okay, now the next thing I want to do is also output so we'll have the description, and then what I want is a second div, and this one is going to output the YouTube video. Okay, and okay, now I'm going to close off that div, and okay, for starters, let's go the YouTube equals item.music_video is what I called it. Okay, and inside of that there will be a link. Okay, so this should output now the link to my YouTube video, just as plain text. Okay, there it is. So if I select any one of these, I should be able to paste that into YouTube. Okay, and it looks like the same song, and it looks like, okay, music video. Now, what I really want to do is not output the link, I want to output the video itself. So the way I'm going to do that is, first of all, I'm going to end. I do have a specific YouTube example that you can go back and look at this in more detail again. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Embed. Okay, and I'm going to select essentially I'm going to copy and paste this code. Okay, so I'll grab that, and let's say I'll create this variable YouTube HTML equals, okay, all of this stuff. Okay, but obviously I don't want to output that same video for each one of these items. So what I need to do is, essentially the only thing that's going to differ between any YouTube embed is going to be this text string here, okay, which is the ID of the video. Okay, so you'll notice up here, that's what it is there. So if we actually look through this, and I did this, I counted from the beginning to the end, okay, I noticed that all of the YouTube videos, the ID within the link to the video is always from the 30th character, and then it's always 11 characters long. So unfortunately my YouTube search results don't just return me the ID. That would be nice, then I could just use that. So what I'm actually going to do is pull out these 11 characters from the YouTube link and then use them to dynamically insert in here. Okay, now the way I'm going to do that is with, I'll create a variable here called YouTube underscore ID. Alright, and that's going to be equal to, and in this case, okay, and I did the same thing here. If you looked at the source code for my movie trailers mashup example, I did the same thing to pull out the YouTube ID here, except I just used the PHP string method rather than the JavaScript one. Okay, so JavaScript has string manipulation functions. One of them is called substr, stands for substring, where I give it the starting character and the length of character, and then the length of characters from that point that I want to extract from a string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, the YouTube ID is equal to YouTube, okay, YouTube, which is my link, dot substring, substr, okay, and if I remember correctly, it's 30, and so it's grab me from the 30th character and then 11 more from that point, and that should pull out the YouTube ID. Okay, so just to see if that's worked, I'm going to output now, instead of the YouTube link, just the YouTube ID. Go back to my example. Okay, so it looks like actually 31. Okay, I've got too many characters there. Let me just refer back. Yeah, okay, so it was 31. Okay, so now you can see it's outputting the IDs of each of these YouTube videos. Okay, so now that I've got that little bit of information, what I can do is replace this part here in my YouTube embed code with YouTube ID. Okay, and then that entire iframe then I can output inside of my YouTube div as YouTube underscore HTML, and hopefully we should now see the YouTube videos embedded along with the description. Okay, and there they are. Okay, now okay, so what I'm going to do is add some styling to this, so to format them a bit more nicely. First of all, I'm going to make the videos a bit smaller. So in the embed code, okay, I'm going to make the YouTube video 320 by 200 pixels, and at this point I'm going to create some CSS styles as well. Okay, so there we go, and what I want to do is, in fact, I'll just copy my CSS styles from my completed example to save a bit of time. Okay, so Okay, and I'm just going to reverse the order of my two divs so that my floating works correctly. Okay, there we go. So now I've kind of got a list. There we are, the top 10 songs. And we've got the, okay, so we've got the picture of the song. We've got links back to the song on the iTunes store where you can look at reviews and so forth. And then we've got the embedded music videos where you could actually play the songs, view the music videos. Okay, now one more thing I'm going to do with jQuery here is I haven't actually, in this example, used any jQuery to manipulate the HTML. I've appended HTML, but I haven't modified it in any way. So what I'm going to do is use what I showed you before, and what I'm going to do is after all of these things have been output, so after this each loop here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select every item div that is odd numbered, and I'm going to add a class which I've created called oddRow. And likewise for the even numbered ones, I'm going to add a class which I've created called evenRow. Okay, and they essentially just have two different background colors, so I get that alternating background color on a list. Hopefully it should work. Okay, looks like that. Okay, so that's added with jQuery, and the important thing with that to remember is that we have to wait until we've output all of the HTML before we do that. Otherwise, the HTML is not going to exist for us to add the class to. Okay, so it's important that we have this loop which outputs each of the div items, and then after that loop, we go, okay, select all of the odd items and add this class, and select all of the even items and add that class. Okay, now just very quickly, the last thing I want to show you is, again, how we're going to make this a bit more interactive. So if I go back to the iTunes Store RSS Generator, okay, you'll notice that it has this drop-down genre box, and if I generate here, okay, you'll notice that it adds genre equals and then a number. So each of these genres have a particular number ID here. So what I'm actually going to do is I want to essentially take this genre drop-down box, and when I select that on my web page, it's going to modify the RSS feed that my pipe accesses, so that it will return different results based on the genre that I've specified. So I'll have to go through this fairly quickly, but hopefully we get through it. So essentially what I'm going to do is take this select drop down, because I essentially need to know the numbers that it uses to signify the different genres. So I'm going to put this here. Okay, and if I refresh my page, okay, there's my drop down. Okay, and you'll see, okay, so this is an HTML form. We did briefly look at HTML text input elements. Okay, this is just the same thing but a drop down box. Okay, you remember they had an attribute called a value. In this case, the values of all of these are different numbers. And what we're going to do is, similarly to how we posted the text field data to Yahoo Pipes, we can do the same thing here. So what I'm going to do is, okay, I'll kind of do this fairly quickly. I'm going to create a function here called fetch, which I'm going to put everything that I've just written inside of, because each time I change that selection, I'm going to need to recall this particular pipe. Okay. Now what I want to do is, okay, so my select button has an ID of feed genre, so I'm going to create a jQuery selector which says feed genre. Okay, and I'm going to bind an event to this called change. Okay, so change is basically saying anytime the value of this drop-down menu changes, then call this function here. So when it changes, what I want to do is first of all get the whatever the value attribute is of the item that I've selected. Okay, and the way that I can do that is say, let me just refer back here for a moment. Okay, so I'm going to select again the feed genre drop down list, and then I'm going to use the jQuery function val. Okay, and that's going to return me the genre value. So I'm going to create a variable here called genre ID. Okay, so each time I click on a different option on this drop-down list, then this genre ID is going to be equal to whatever the value attribute of the particular item I've selected is. And then once I've done that, I can call this fetch function, which will take a genre ID. Okay, and it will perform this get JSON function and access the pipe again. So we'll go fetch genre ID. Okay, and all I need to do is in the same way that we sent information to the pipe using the PHP example, I do the same thing here, which is by adding it on to the end of the request URL. So what I'm going to do here is say if genre ID. So if genre ID is actually defined, then add to the end of URL and underscore, and I just have to check in my pipe. Okay, remembering that I have to name this thing the same thing as the input name on my input module. Okay, so n genre equals plus genre ID. Okay, now hopefully this should work. Okay, so you'll notice now that it comes up with nothing to start with, okay, and that's because I'm not calling it by default first, but when I select a genre, okay, it should come up with the appropriate results. Let's check this. Sorry, my bad. Okay, so there we now have the alternative results showing up. Now, I'm not quite finished with this because you'll notice if I, for example, let's show country. Okay, this is working, but what it's doing is it's just appending all of these to the end of the list. So there's something I need to do. I actually, each time before I output the HTML, what I'm going to do is with the content div, I'm going to set the HTML, and I could set it to be empty, but in this case it might be useful if I, for example, just say something like loading. Okay, and now when I refresh it, okay, alright, we say it's loading, and when I select another one, okay, you can see that's loaded now, and it hasn't added it to the end, it's loaded it over the top. Okay, so we'll go again, we'll try Jazz. Okay, and probably what I want to do just before it outputs everything is actually get rid of this loading entirely. So where'd I put that? Okay, so just before my each loop, I'll set the HTML of that content div to be blank. Okay. Okay, so that's pretty much that example. The completed example has comments, and it has a little bit more functionality. It has a call at the beginning which calls all genres by default, so it still does load the complete list. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to get through today. So as you can see, we've done pretty much the same thing we did with PHP, but with JavaScript and jQuery now. As I said at the beginning, it's up to you to choose which tools are going to work best with your assignment. But if you do want to look into this, then I'd suggest looking at both the jQuery website and also the W3 School sections on JavaScript and jQuery.